July 5th. 1942, the morning fog lifted from Alcatraz Island to reveal what would become one of World War II's most consequential discoveries, lying crumpled in the tundra. Lieutenant William Bill Thies stood at the edge of a muddy ravine, staring down at the twisted wreckage of a Mitsubishi A6 M20 fighter, its rising sun insignia still visible beneath layers of Aleutian grime. The Japanese pilot, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, lay dead in the cockpit, his neck broken from the violent impact when his damaged aircraft had flipped during an attempted belly landing nearly a month earlier. Thies felt no triumph in this moment, only the electric realization that American forces had finally captured what aviation experts desperately needed, an intact enemy fighter that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. The Zero had earned its fearsome reputation through speed, maneuverability, and range that seemed impossible by Western engineering standards. American pilots returning from combat brought tales that sounded like mythology. Japanese fighters that could turn inside any maneuver, climb faster than anything in the U.S. arsenal, and engage targets at distances that defied conventional fuel calculations. Navy Commander James Russell, overseeing intelligence operations in the Aleutian campaign, had made the Zero's capabilities his obsession. According to intelligence reports compiled throughout spring of 1942, American Wildcats and P-40 Warhawks were being systematically destroyed by an opponent they couldn't outmaneuver or outrun. The kill ratios told a brutal story. Japanese pilots were averaging 5 to 7 American aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. Koga's final flight had begun during the June 4th attack on Dutch Harbor, part of Japan's diversionary operation during the Midway campaign. His Zero had taken ground fire that punctured the oil reservoir, and flying with his 2 wingmen. Koga had attempted an emergency landing on what appeared from altitude to be solid ground. The Aleutian tundra had other plans. What looked like firm earth was actually a deceptive layer of vegetation over saturated muskeg. The Zero's wheels caught, and the aircraft had pitched forward violently, snapping Koga's neck instantly while leaving the fighter remarkably preserved in the soft, wet ground. Navy personnel didn't locate the crash site until nearly a month later, when a patrol spotted the wreckage. Thies, serving as part of the Aleutian reconnaissance operations, immediately recognized the significance. This wasn't another pile of shattered aluminum. This was a complete aircraft system waiting to be understood. Within hours, Commander Russell received word and began organizing what would become one of the war's most important salvage operations. The context of this discovery's importance is documented in naval aviation histories, particularly in Zero Fighter by Akira Yoshimura, which details how desperate Allied forces had become to understand their opponent. The salvage team arrived within days, bringing specialized equipment to extract the Zero from its muddy grave. They worked with methodical precision, documenting every panel, every system, every detail before the aircraft was carefully disassembled for transport. By late July, the Zero was crated and aboard a transport vessel bound for Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. Commander Russell accompanied the shipment personally, understanding that what lay in those crates could fundamentally alter the Pacific Air War's trajectory. The question wasn't whether the Zero was extraordinary combat, had proven that beyond doubt. The question was why. August 27th, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Edward Eddie Sanders stood in Hangar 7 at Naval Air Station North Island, watching technicians swarm over the reassembled Zero-like surgeons, examining a patient who'd survived the impossible. Sanders, a Naval Academy graduate and experienced test pilot with over 2,000 hours in various fighter types, had been specifically selected to lead the evaluation team. The aircraft before him looked simultaneously elegant and crude, a paradox that Japanese engineering had somehow transformed into the Pacific's deadliest fighter. Its aluminum skin was thinner than any American combat aircraft, stretched over a frame that seemed almost delicate when compared to the robust construction of the Grumman Wildcat parked in the adjacent hangar. The technical evaluation team spent 3 weeks dissecting every aspect of the Zero's construction before Sanders would even sit in the cockpit. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about fighter design. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Harold Ammerman led the structural analysis, and his reports read like revelation. The Zero achieved its remarkable range through radical weight reduction that bordered on reckless by American standards. There was no armor plating protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks that could survive bullet strikes, no redundant systems for battle damage. The Japanese had built a fighter that assumed perfect conditions and perfect execution, trading survivability for performance in a calculated gamble that had paid lethal dividends for nearly a year. Ammerman's team found the wings particularly fascinating. They were longer than any American fighters, providing exceptional lift at low speeds and contributing to the Zero's legendary turning ability. The wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area, was extraordinarily low, meaning the aircraft could change direction with minimal radius. But that same design created vulnerabilities. The thin wing spars couldn't handle excessive stress, and the ailerons, the control surfaces that governed roll, were manually operated without hydraulic assistance. At high speeds, the air pressure against those large ailerons would become immense, making rapid rolls physically demanding and ultimately impossible as velocity increased. Sanders studied these reports with growing excitement. Every advantage revealed a corresponding weakness, the engineering equivalent of a glass cannon. The Zero could outmaneuver American fighters in slow-speed turning fights, but what happened when speed increased? What were the aircraft's limits when pushed beyond its optimal performance envelope? These questions would determine whether American pilots could develop tactics to counter the Zero's dominance, and Sanders would be the first to find answers. On September 15th, Sanders finally climbed into the Zero's cockpit for the first time. The seat had been modified to accommodate his taller frame. Japanese pilots averaged 5 feet 6 inches, while Sanders stood 6 feet tall. The instrument panel was a mixture of familiar concepts executed in unfamiliar ways. Japanese characters marked various gauges, but numbers remained universal. The throttle moved backward to increase power, opposite to American convention. The stick felt surprisingly light in his hand, almost delicate. Chief Mechanic Donald "Don" Reeser, who'd overseen the aircraft's restoration, stood on the wing providing orientation. "She's ready when you are, Commander," Reeser said, his Chicago accent thick with pride at the restoration work. These Japanese engineers knew what they were doing. Sanders nodded, running through mental checklists. The SAC-A 14-cylinder radial engine had been tested extensively on the ground, producing its rated 950 horsepower without issues. But ground tests couldn't reveal what happened when this fighter encountered the stresses of aerial combat. That discovery would come only when Sanders pushed the Zero through maneuvers that would determine whether American pilots could survive encounters with this remarkable, deadly machine. Tomorrow, he would take the captured Zero into California's skies and begin answering questions that had cost hundreds of American lives. September 16th, 1942. Dawn broke clear and cool over San Diego Bay as Sanders completed his pre-flight inspection of the captured Zero. Now bearing temporary U.S. Navy markings to prevent friendly fire incidents, the engine coughed once before roaring to life. Its distinctive sound different from the Pratt and Whitney engines Sanders knew intimately. He taxied to the end of runway 27, feeling the aircraft's responsiveness to every input. The Zero seemed alive under his hands, eager and sensitive in ways American fighters weren't. Control tower cleared him for takeoff, and Sanders advanced the throttle backward. He reminded himself feeling 950 horses pull him forward. The takeoff roll was remarkably short. The Zero lifted off after barely 400 feet, climbing at an angle that would have stalled a wildcat. Sanders' heart raced as altitude accumulated with stunning rapidity. At 2,000 feet, he leveled off and began gentle turns, feeling out the aircraft's handling characteristics. The controls were light, responsive, requiring minimal input to generate substantial response. This was the key to the Zero's dogfighting supremacy. A pilot could throw the aircraft into extreme maneuvers with minimal effort, conserving energy while opponents wrestled heavier controls. Sanders spent the first 20 minutes exploring basic handling, climbs, descents, gentle turns, speed variations. The Zero felt honest and predictable within normal flight parameters. Its stall characteristics were benign, giving plenty of warning before the wings lost lift. The visibility was excellent in most directions, though the heavy framing around the canopy created blind spots. He noted everything methodically, knowing that Commander Russell and the evaluation team would dissect every observation. At 8,000 feet over the Pacific, Sanders decided to begin performance testing. He pushed the throttle forward-backward to maximum continuous power and watched the airspeed indicator climb. 100 knots, 120, 150. The Zero accelerated smoothly, the engine note steady and strong. At 180 knots, Sanders attempted a standard aileron roll to the right. The aircraft responded crisply, rolling through 360 degrees without hesitation. He tried again to the left, equally responsive. This was expected performance, matching what intelligence reports had indicated. Sanders pushed the speed higher. 200 knots, 210, 220. Now he was exceeding the Zero's typical combat speeds, entering the performance envelope where American fighters usually operated. At 225 knots, he again attempted a roll to the right, applying standard stick pressure. The aircraft began to roll, but sluggishly. The stick felt different, heavier, resistant. Sanders applied more pressure, pushing harder against the aileron resistance. The roll rate had slowed dramatically compared to lower speeds. Something was changing in the Zero's handling as velocity increased. He pushed faster still, diving to build speed. 235 knots, 240, 250. The airframe shook slightly, the engine screaming at maximum power. At 255 knots, Sanders attempted another roll to the right, pushed the stick hard to the right, using significant arm strength. The Zero barely responded. The ailerons were effectively frozen, the air pressure at this speed creating forces the manual control system couldn't overcome. The aircraft wallowed slightly but refused to roll right with any meaningful rate. Then Sanders tried rolling left. The response was better, still heavy, but achievable. The asymmetry was striking and unexpected. Something about the Zero's design created differential handling characteristics at high speed, favoring left rolls over right rolls. This wasn't mentioned in any intelligence reports because no Allied pilot had survived high-speed encounters long enough to test such specifics. Sanders was discovering the Zero's Achilles heel in real time, finding the seam in Japanese engineering where performance and physics collided. He spent another 40 minutes exploring this phenomenon, documenting the exact speeds where controllability degraded, testing different power settings and configurations. The pattern held consistent, above 200 knots. The Zero became increasingly reluctant to roll right, and above 230 knots, right, rolls became nearly impossible without extraordinary effort. September 17th. 1942 Lieutenant Commander Sanders sat in the North Island briefing room before an audience of Navy pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers. His flight notes spread across the table like evidence in a trial. Commander Russell stood beside a blackboard covered in diagrams and calculations, smoking a cigarette with the nervous energy of a man who understood that the information about to be shared could save hundreds of lives. The room was packed beyond capacity, with pilots standing along the walls, all eager to understand why their opponent dominated the skies and, more importantly, how to beat it. "Gentlemen," Sanders began, his voice carrying the authority of direct experience, "the Zero is everything we feared and less than we thought. Yesterday I discovered something the Japanese either don't know or haven't considered. Critical, their fighter has a fatal flaw at high speeds." He described the roll asymmetry in detail, explaining how above 200 knots indicated airspeed. The Zero's ability to roll right degraded precipitously, while left rolls remained somewhat viable. Lieutenant Harold Ammerman stood to provide the engineering explanation. According to his analysis, the phenomenon resulted from multiple factors converging in the Zero's design. The large ailerons, lacking hydraulic boost, required manual force to deflect against increasing air pressure. At high speeds, the forces became enormous, approaching the limits of human strength. But why the asymmetry? Marmon explained that the propeller rotation created a phenomenon called propeller torque effect and spiraling slipstream, which influenced the aircraft's behavior. The Zero's propeller rotated clockwise when viewed from the pilot's seat, creating forces that had to be countered by the rudder and trim. These rotational forces, combined with the aileron control system's design and the pilot's position, created conditions where right rolls required fighting both the aerodynamic forces and the engine's rotational effects, while left rolls partially benefited from these forces. Additionally, the Zero's aileron control cables routed differently for left and right ailerons due to cockpit layout, creating slight differences in mechanical advantage. At low speeds, these differences were negligible. At high speeds, they became decisive. The captured Zero, now designated Air Technical Intelligence Unit property, had revealed a vulnerability that existed in every Zero in the Japanese fleet, a weakness built into thousands of aircraft by design choices that prioritized low-speed maneuverability over high-speed control authority. Commander Russell took over the briefing, outlining tactical implications, This means, he said, stabbing his cigarette toward the assembled pilots, that when you encounter a zero, you need to keep your speed up. Force the fight above 220 knots if possible. Don't try to turn with them at slow speeds. You'll lose every time. But get fast, stay fast, and you can control the engagement. The room erupted with questions. How do you maintain speed in combat? What if the zero pilot refuses to follow? How do pilots exploit the roll limitation? Sanders and Russell spent 3 hours working through scenarios, developing tactics that would eventually be codified as the Thatch Weave and other high-speed defensive maneuvers. The information spread through naval aviation like wildfire, briefed 2 squadron commanders who immediately began modifying their training programs. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Jimmy Thatch, already experimenting with mutual defense tactics, absorbed this information and refined his approach. According to accounts documented in the Wildcat in World War II by Barrett Tillman, Thatch recognized that coordinated attacks at high speed, with aircraft defending each other and refusing to slow down for turning engagements, could neutralize the Zero's advantages. The captured Zero's secrets were becoming operational tactics. By late September, test pilots from Army Air Forces arrived to fly the Zero and develop similar tactics for their fighters. Captain Fred Borsati climbed into the cockpit and confirmed Sanders' findings, then took the aircraft through dive tests that revealed another limitation. In high-speed dives, the Zero's controls became mushy and unresponsive, making it nearly impossible to track targets or evade attacks. American fighters, built more robustly, could dive faster and pull out more aggressively, creating another tactical option. The intelligence gathered from this single captured aircraft was revolutionizing American fighter tactics, transforming the Pacific Air War from one-sided slaughter into competitive combat. October 12, 1942, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise steaming toward the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Edward Booch O'Hare stood in the ready room, addressing his squadron with a passion born of recent revelation. The intelligence packet from North Island had reached fleet carriers, and pilots gathered around dog-eared copies of the Zero evaluation report, like scholars studying sacred texts. O'Hare, who would later earn the Medal of... In Japan, Petty Officer Koga achieved posthumous recognition as a skilled pilot whose sacrifice, however unintended, contributed to aviation history. His hometown erected a memorial acknowledging his service and the unusual circumstances of his aircraft's capture. Japanese aviation historians approach the story with mixed feelings, pride in their engineer's achievement tempered by recognition that the capture accelerated their nation's defeat. The broader lesson transcends specific aircraft or tactics. The Akaton Zero demonstrated how thoroughly understanding enemy capabilities could offset numerical or technological disadvantages. American forces in 1942 faced superior Japanese fighters flown by better-trained pilots. Rather than accepting defeat or waiting for better aircraft, they learned everything possible about their opponent and adapted tactics accordingly. This intellectual flexibility, combined with industrial capacity and pilot training programs, ultimately proved decisive. Today, nearly 80 years after Lieutenant Thies discovered that crumpled fighter in Aleutian tundra, aviation enthusiasts and historians continue studying the captured Zero's impact. The aircraft serves as a reminder that wars are won not just through courage or technology, but through intelligence, adaptation, and the willingness to learn from every available source. One damaged Japanese fighter, piloted by a 19-year-old who died attempting an emergency landing, ultimately helped save thousands of American lives and shifted the Pacific War's momentum. In warfare's brutal mathematics, such ironies occur with surprising frequency, but few are as well documented or consequential as the captured Zero that couldn't roll right above 200 knots.